Thank you, and I'm very happy and honored to be here again. Let me say I was here 5 years ago when the United States had Barack Obama as president, and I'm here tonight, this evening, when Donald Trump is president. And aside from the obvious difference, it is representative of what I think is a global challenge on which way your generation will choose to lead as we go further into the 21st century. We have those that have embraced nationalism, hegemony, and we have those that have embraced diversity and moving forward in terms of a world that adjusts to the fact that everyone does not have to have their values and standards set by one that dominates the global cultural as well as economic and political stage. Every time there is a breakthrough in history, it is usually followed immediately by a backlash. And those are the ones that are trying to hold on to what I would argue is the inevitability of human progress. No matter how hard they hold on, they cannot stop human progress. Now, you can turn back the clock, but you can't turn back time. You can look at your clock or your watch if you wear one and turn it back to 5 o'clock, but it's still a little after 8, no matter what you tell yourself. And the world is diverse, and the dominance of white males will never return as the dominant factor on the globe anymore. That's not coming back. And the problem I think we have in the Western world is adjusting to that, whether it be what we're seeing going on in Italy, whether we see some aspects of what's going on in the UK, whether we look at the 8 years of Barack Obama being followed by the total antithesis of that, where you have a billionaire become the leader of popularism and blue-collar workers in Appalachia that could never afford a night in one of his hotels. But it's the backlash, and it's driven by emotions that make people comfortable in their silos because that is how they feel that they are given some legitimacy. My challenge is to young people of all races in your generations as you prepare for life is you have got to decide which side of history you're on, and aggressively seek to be a part of that. Now, there are those that will choose to hold to the past. I argue, just know that you are holding on to something that will not succeed. Look at what we have just witnessed. We've witnessed such great contradictions. The world watched when we saw a person of color marry into the royal family. It was a beautiful thing. It was heart-wrenching. It was something when I saw this young lady walk down that aisle and her mother standing there with long dreads, and then the bishop got up and Bishop Murray quoting Martin Luther King in that chapel with the royal family there. This is something that is symbolically very significant. And then my heart was warmed. He mentioned Dr. King, and I'm a child of that movement. And then the choir comes and sings Benny King, Stand By Me. And then they ended with This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine. Etta James song, and I preached Etta James's funeral. And I almost forgot that at the same time we are welcoming this beautiful lady of color into the royal family in Britain, that we had the Windrush scandal where we were putting others out because of this hard, we would say alt-right policy of immigration that forgets their parents were invited here to help build the country after the war, and because documentation and all, now we're pushing them out like they are some kinds of intruders rather than people that were raised and contributed to society. It matches in the States where we have a man who talks about building a wall between Mexico and the United States and identifies Mexicans as rapists. There's a line that goes around this of everyone trying to resist with this me against them. I would argue that the challenge of your generation is to break through that. First of all, it is reputed that many of the leaders of UK and Europe, if not global leaders, come from these colleges that make the Oxford Union. Well, if you look at the globe is no longer dominated by white males. If you look even at the economic global situation, if you look at technology, the world has advanced beyond where you can try and separate. Money has been going through a globalization. Technology and information through globalization. So there's no longer where you can tell people what you want and it can't be checked, or you can deal with commerce in a way and it cannot be offset. We've got to deal with superpowers that are no longer look like those that they looked like 100 years ago. It's a different world. And if you are not prepared to deal with diversity in the world, you cannot lead in the world. If you cannot deal with justice in the world, you can't lead in the world. So when you look at disproportionate amount of marijuana arrests in London, blacks, people of color to whites, either we smoke more joints or we get arrested more. Either we are more rowdy or we get arrested more. When you look at and this is data that has been established, the disproportionate sentencing. You can't have law that does not operate equally, and you determine where you enforce the law based on who you are enforcing it, rather than the law being enforced equally and fairly and expect that society to not have problems. You cannot have situations where you have immigration laws. We're going to be hard. We're going to protect the borders. We don't want outsiders. But you start with the most vulnerable and the most obvious, because it becomes politically problematic to mess with some, but it becomes expendable to mess with Caribbeans and Africans. Or in the United States, Mexicans. He's not talking about building a wall to Canada. He's not talking about building a wall for Eastern Europeans. He comes from New York like I do. And there are all kinds of immigrants in New York. But there is this constant manipulation of race. And if some of us dare speak to it, we're the race baiters. We are the troublemakers. So I walk over to your seat and I knock you down and I put my foot on your neck and you start saying, let me up, and I said, you're disturbing the peace. No, I have put you in an unfair, unjust situation. So what am I asking you to do? Consent to it with silence? The least you could do is object to the situation. So the imbalance, when you look at income, when you look at business opportunities, when you look at empowerment in terms of politics, the imbalance is obvious. So you're asking those that become systematically reduced to the inferior position to not disturb you while this imbalance continues. And I think real leadership is those that say, no, imbalance is not fair, and that people ought to achieve what they can in life based on merit, not based on their race, religion, or sexual orientation. One of the reasons that we've had the debates we've had around the question of women's right to choose, or gay and lesbian and transgender rights, is the arrogance of the discussion that we, whoever we are, should have the right to decide for people what to do with their lives. I may disagree. I can go whatever church I want. I can have whatever moral standards I want. I can have whatever values I want. But do I have the right to enforce them on you? And once I do that, am I now making it possible that if you gain power, you can outlaw and you can make it legal to make whatever I believe in, whatever I choose to be wrong? So it is a matter of, are we going to deal with diversity and freedom? Or are we going back into our silos in terms of nationalism? We're going through it with this president. And in some cases, you're going through it in the UK and other parts of Europe, where people are going insular. People are afraid because they have been played upon that the only thing that makes them comfortable in their position is at least you're better than them. The way that they've been able to whip up a lot of hysteria in the United States with poor whites who are victimized by an unfair system themselves is to say, well, it's the blacks. At least you're not that. And if it wasn't for them, you'd be doing better. We've been doubly unemployed, the whites, since slavery. Last time we had full black unemployment was slavery. We didn't get paid, but we all had a job. But they've been able to give this impression that we have people's jobs, when black unemployment has always been double that of whites. But if you can whip up people's emotions into blaming them, rather than dealing with logic and a real sound analysis that we are all in one world and deserve the same opportunities and the same protection under the law, then you can easily call the good bad and the bad good. Those that have made the significant strides in society and in history is those that move toward where human progress was not only headed, but inevitably about to occur. Those that have tried to resist are the ones that end up in the junk pile of history, that all of their credentials and all of their pedigree and all of their standing in society matters not, because they used that to affirm something that was unreal and untrue. My challenge to you as students that will be in leadership is that you must go against this backlash era that has grasped globally and say, no, we must move forward. We have made progress. I look at the UK. I'm very happy to see that the Prime Minister has said that they want to audit, that they want to audit the agencies and see where diversity is. I think that's a good thing. But I also think they've got to deal with this Windrush scandal. I also think they've got to deal with the whole stop and search that is unfair and going on in parts of England and certainly in London. We had to deal with that in New York and other cities. They called it stop and frisk, where even in all white areas, there were 7-8 times more blacks stopped than whites. And of course, they use these the excuse, well, you know, we got more calls about those than we got about whites. Well, how could you get calls about people that are just transit coming through? Do you understand the humiliation of somebody just because of the color of their skin is thrown up against a wall and searched and patted down like a criminal and have done nothing wrong? The humiliation of seeing people just totally discarded of any dignity, that you are automatically a suspect because of your race. This year alone, I've had to deal with 2 or 3 incidents in this country in one of the retailers that has stores that has eateries in the South, Waffle House they call it. Young lady goes to eat with 2 of her friends. They charge her for the forks and the knives. She says, I've never heard of that before. I'm paying for the meal. The forks and the knives don't go with it. This is our policy. Can I have the phone number to your corporate office? They call the police. They get into an argument with the police, and the police drag her to where her clothes is up and her breast exposed. Someone videotaped it. We rallying for her now. I went to Mobile, Alabama. A week later or 2, young man in Warsaw, North Carolina, gets into an argument. The manager of a Waffle House calls him a homophobic name and calls the cops. They put him in a chokehold and throw him to the ground, put him in a police car with a canine in the back seat, who miraculously, and this canine didn't go to Oxford, but he figured out how to unlock the cage he was in. Brilliant. These are things I'm not talking about in the 60s. I'm talking about right now, this year. Stephon Clark, young man in his grandmother's backyard, 300 feet from a bed, shot. They said we thought his cell phone was a gun, Sacramento, California. Family does an autopsy. 6 bullets in his back and his side. So where were you in danger that you had to shoot at him 8 times? These things are happening now, but the troublemakers are Colin Kaepernick, because he would dare do something as disruptive as get on his knee before the game, not in the middle of the game, not out on the field where he's supposed to be playing, before the game. Well, you've got to respect the flag. No, we respect the flag by making the flag stand for what the flag says, freedom and justice for all. What about those that have a religion that don't believe in pledging to the flag? Are they being disruptive? I went to school with kids that their religion forbid them from pledging to the flag. So you have the right to exercise what you want. But the troublemakers, the race baiters, are those of us that would dare question this sense of supremacy. And I'm saying that you must choose which side you stand on and stand for. So as you pursue your careers, you cannot do your career in isolation from the world that you live in. Because even if you close your eyes and ears and say, that's not my business, you and I know that based on this setup, if you're a certain race and a certain class and caste, you gain from a privilege that is unfair and that you should challenge. So I give Oxford credit. They came out with a report out of the schools and colleges that make Oxford. 8 of them had no black admissions in 1 year. That's great that you came out and said it. Now what are we going to do about it? If you are injured and I run to your bed and I look and I rip your shirt back and I show your injury to the world, and then I walk away and leave you injured, I'm as guilty as the ones that injured you. Oxford should not represent the lack of diversity. Oxford can't be that brilliant and can't figure out how to go and get people of color to come to the campus. You can figure out the complexities of philosophy. You can break down atoms, you can figure out scientific stuff that nobody could, but you can't figure out how to get people from Brixton and other colleges that maybe not be Brixton, but that are diversified to come to campus. You can have one exclusive school, have more students than all the blacks on campus. Oxford, as brilliant as you are. That is your challenge. That will define this generation. That will say where you made a mark and a difference, that the errors of those that would not grow were beginning to end and demonstratively changed in your generation. Contradictions will not last. You cannot stand up and brag as you should about how England joined with others and brought Hitler to his knees, but at the same time continue colonizing India and Africa, calling Gandhi names. That's a glaring contradiction. And then you get angry if those that are from India or Africa don't join you in applauding people that colonized them and denied them their rights. And if they dare not join in the applause, they are troublemakers. They are somehow not going along with the national pride and spirit. No, they have self-respect and self-esteem, and they understand history. And if we understand history, then you need to choose what side of history that you will sit on. Thank you very much.
Reverend Sharpton, thank you so much for joining us today and for giving a fascinating speech. I will start with a few questions before opening up to the audience. So my first question is about the US criminal justice system. So at the end of President Obama's presidency, the first since President Carter, there were fewer people in jail by the time he left office than by the time he came in. But many claim that now under the new administration, those achievements are under threat. And a recent high-profile case, that of Harvey Weinstein, who recently was indicted on charges of rape and assault, went back home after paying a bail of $1 million. Meanwhile, there are almost 500,000 Americans in jail awaiting trial because they cannot afford bail. Could you talk to us a little bit more about the bail system?
A lot of the work that I've done with National Action Network has been around criminal justice. And I think the book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, is probably the best reference book. Because when you deal with sentencing, when you deal with, well, you can start with arrest and prosecution, all the way to sentencing and bail reform, it is clearly by any data, including the Justice Department data, based on race and economic circumstance. What President Obama recognized, and those of us that worked from the civil rights community in the United States and had access to him and worked with him, is that the unfairness of that made the whole society poisoned, because when these that are victimized by it do get out, they're crippled for life. Their families they can't provide for. You're a felon, you can't get a job. In many states, you can't even vote. Yet we tell them go back and redeem themselves when we give them no ability to do it. Barack Obama, as president, commuted more sentences for low-level drug offenders, nonviolent, than the 11 presidents that preceded him. We worked with him on this. This president comes in, he appoints Jeff Sessions, who was a senator from Alabama, who was against the Voting Rights Act, and he appointed him the Attorney General. He met with 5 or 6 of us that lead national civil rights organizations and said emphatically they were not going to continue that. They were not commuting any sentences, and they felt that they were going to take a harder line. Now, you've got to remember now, this president that stopped commutations is the same president talking about pardoning his friends. So he just doesn't believe in dealing with what is fair for the society as a whole. I think it is an absolute to give someone, Kim Kardashian, who met with President Trump last week. She's the only Kim that got a meeting so far. And she brought in 2 cases. One of them was a 61-year-old great-grandmother who got life for her first nonviolent drug offense. He came back and pardoned the next day after meeting with Kim Kardashian. He pardoned a right-wing commentator who had made racist statements, called Barack Obama a boy, and grown-up Trayvon Martin. That was his answer. And I think that that is something that is startling and repulsive.
Thank you. As a follow-up question, opponents of President Trump seem divided over whether to pursue impeachment. Those in favor claim that Trump could be impeached for obstructing justice or for financial conflicts with foreign governments. And they argue that impeachment should be a priority because of the threat that Trump poses to immigrants and black people in America. Others, however, believe that the best way to defeat Trump and his ideology is to defeat him in the next election. And if we impeach him, we will be left with Mike Pence, who may pose a similar or even worse threat. Where do you fall on this debate?
I think that clearly if there are criminal acts and when the Mueller investigation is over, and let's not forget that he's already made several indictments, there's been several pleads of guilty, so this whole thing about the investigation hasn't gone anywhere. It has, because you've already had several indictments and people saying, yeah, I did it. So the investigation is going somewhere. I think that if it warrants criminal prosecution, it should be given. I do not think the president can pardon himself, because I think there was a little rumble in 1776 about we didn't want a monarchy in the United States. I think that's what that was about. I don't know. I'm at Oxford. Maybe you could tell, but that's what I thought they were fighting about. So how do you have a president that can pardon himself and that not be a monarchy? I think also, though, that the foolproof way is to mobilize and organize voters and be prepared to vote them out. Because it is true that if we get Mr. Trump out in terms of some legal or impeachable offense, that Vice President Pence, who would then become president, is probably further to the right than him on many of the causes of civil and human rights.
Thank you. So my final question, it's about the 2018 midterms. So Reverend, you travel across the country and the world talking to people about the problems that are important to them. What do you think the Democrats should use as their main campaign issues in the midterms? Can all candidates for the House of Representatives representing such diverse districts all run with a national platform?
I think that they must do both. They must run with a national tone that we need to continue the move forward that I spoke about today by respecting people's rights. We already just had the Supreme Court with a decision yesterday on a baker, which was an insult to civil rights. It was directed at the LGBTQ community, but it could be any of us. Because if you now make it legal for people to decide they're not gonna make a cake for somebody that's gay, they can say next week we're not making it for somebody Baptist. So am I gonna wait till they get to that? It is wrong. And Pence was the guy in Indiana that was advocating this. So for Pence to become president is not a step forward, which is why I think ultimately we've got to deal at the election box.
Thank you. We'll now take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to reach you. And please stand up and stick to one question. For the first question, we'll go to the end of the first row.
Hello, Reverend Sharpton. Thank you so much for your time and for coming here. My question is really about how to strategically position the Black story. So not just from the American perspective, but I would say the larger Black community. Because I think for a certain group of people, the only story they see of Black people is either of us shouting because someone's leg is on our neck, or the reaction that we're giving to someone being treated unjustly. I want to think about how we can how you're engaging with different levels of leadership, whether through education, through politics, through business, and through even especially the media, about how we start positioning the Black story so people understand what it means when someone says, I've been treated unjustly because of the way I look. They judge me based on the color of my skin. Because I think until we start actually changing minds and start teaching people to understand that perspective, there's always going to be that group far to the extreme that says you're just shouting and making trouble.
That's a very
Thanks.
good question. I think that, one, we need a multi-level strategy, and everybody should not do the same thing. One of the things I tell a lot of people in my own organization around the states is that just because people don't join a protest, don't make them a sellout. That people have different roles. I remember we were marching about a police shooting once, and I made this fiery, passionate speech, and we all went and laid down and went to jail, and they had us in the back waiting to see the judge, about 100 of us. And I looked over and I saw the attorney, and I said, what are you doing in here? He said, I got caught up in the speech, I just threw my body down. I said, well, then who gonna get us out of here? I mean, we all have different roles that we must play, and we must celebrate those that use their platforms to play different roles, because we need as many people that are professionals that say, no, I'm not out there shouting, but it happened to me. And that's why I salute what Kaepernick did. That's why I salute LeBron when we were in the middle of Trayvon Martin wearing a T-shirt for Trayvon Martin, because that was not Al Sharpton, that was LeBron. And I think that the more of us that reinforce that, saying you don't have to do what I do. I shock people into something's wrong, and I take the flack for it. I never have gotten involved in a case where the family didn't call me, and I tell them part of what I do, aside from we provide services, if we can help with lawyers and mental health and people that because you've been traumatized, is that we go out and grab the attention. So people tell you, oh, Al Sharpton wants publicity. That's exactly what I want. That's what people call me for. They don't call me to keep it a secret. They call me because they want somebody to know something happened. But that does not mean you don't need others in other areas that lead and do things just as important. And I think you're absolutely right. We've got to get the message out by having multiplicity of platforms and doing what is done. So if I can come to an Oxford or Trinity College in Dublin or wherever and raise the issues, that is not taken away from the fact that we need people that come to the campus to pass and go back into the world and help make the change. Because there's no reason to open the door if nobody's going to walk through and use the door.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, we'll go to the gentleman all the way in the back.
Thank you, Reverend Sharpton, for coming this evening and sharing your wisdom and time with our community. I was wondering what inspires you to do the work that you need to do for our country at this time?
You know, I started as a boy preacher in a Pentecostal church. You are permitted to be a boy preacher. Wasn't many, but I was one. And I preached. I used to go home from church with my mother and father and preach to my sister's dolls. And they never responded, but they were a decent congregation. And I started preaching in public when I was about 4. And so I grew up in the black church. When I was around 11 or 12, I got caught up, it was late 60s, I got caught up watching the rallies, wanting to get involved. And my mother, by then my father had abandoned us, my mother was very strict Pentecostal church person. And she was worried I was going to leave the ministry because she wanted me to grow up and be a Pentecostal bishop. And she brought me to a clergyman named Reverend William Jones and said, you're involved in these rallies and all. I don't want him to be a militant out there with guns and stuff. Would you take him under your arm? And he introduced me to his partner who led the national group for Dr. King at that time, Jesse Jackson. And they raised me in it. I've been in it all my life. When I got old enough, I said, I don't want to pastor church. I don't want to be a bishop. My calling is social justice. So what I do is my ministry. This is what I believed I was called to do. And I've been stabbed leading demonstrations. I've spent as much as 3 months in jail, 30 days, 4 or 5 times. Nobody could pay you to take a knife in your chest. Nobody could pay you to take 3 months in jail, 30 days and all. So I believe in what I'm doing, and I believe it from a religious conviction. But I work with people that are atheists. I don't think everybody's got to believe the way I believe to do what we do. And I think that we've got to work together for the common good, but as long as you know why you're doing what you're doing, and I know why I'm doing what I'm doing, if we can merge, it only makes us stronger.
Thank you. Next question, we'll go to the second row.
Thank you so much for coming tonight, Reverend Sharpton, and for your words. Many prominent black intellectuals and writers, the likes of James Baldwin and Angela Davis and Malcolm X, have publicly expressed solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And they've likened the experience of African Americans living in the United States with that of Palestinians living under occupation. I was wondering, what is your view on this, and how can you make this a resonant issue within the African American community?
I have said publicly, I went to Israel and Palestine. I met with, in fact, when I went to Israel, I was the guest of Sharon Peres, and he said I should go talk with Yasser Arafat, and I did. I was attacked in the press for doing it. I think that you must respect and protect the Palestinian state. I think that what we are seeing in terms of the disregard for the rights of Palestinians on the land that they're in is something that is a human rights issue that must be dealt with. And I think that what we have in the present Prime Minister Netanyahu is something that we should all resist. And I'm not anti-Israel. I'm not one of those that does not feel that Israel has a right to be protected. But protection does not give you the right to have a policy that robs others. I think that where Arafat and the whole accord was moving with Rabin and then into Perez was in the right direction. I think that, again, we've gone back to polar opposites, and I think that is wrong. And I think it's, and let me just say from my own silo in the movement that the names you mentioned are prominent, but don't forget, Reverend Joseph Lowry went to Palestine. Jesse Jackson went to Palestine. A lot of people got criticized in the King movement for doing that a long time before some of the names you named even got into that issue. Not that I'm being territorial.
Thank you. Next question, we'll go to the first hand to the left in the second row. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. I'm really curious what some of your motivations and thoughts were towards strategy and advocating cases that were very difficult and lacked some of the evidence that we have today in the forms of footage. So for example, with the Tawana Brawley case that lost in the grand jury in 1988, you were one of the main advocates saying that, you know, the government covered up police officers raping her. There was a huge amount of conspiracy and effort involving many actors, including the KKK. These are really big accusations, and they're not something that I wouldn't believe, but I know a lot of America wouldn't believe. And I'm curious how you approach kind of making these very bold statements and drawing these lines and advocating for really difficult cases.
I think that my motivation is that, as I said, I've been doing this as an activist all my life. So when someone presents a situation to me, my first thing is there a possible violation of their rights? And to bring it into the courts to determine whether it is right or not. Now, a grand jury only determines whether there's probable cause, not whether or not one is guilty or not. And I said, 1988 you raised, 2 lawyers who were very prominent, civil rights lawyers, and the mother of Ms. Brawley had started this case in, I think, November of '87, came to me in March of '88, and I said, yeah, this should go to trial. They named 3 people, one who had died. To me, there's enough to go to trial. And the prosecutor, who was one of those accused, would not go in front of the grand jury. Then the grand jury comes back and say they think she lied. Well, my thing was, well, then why don't we determine that in a court of law? What they won't talk about is a year later, they arrested 5 boys for raping a white woman in Central Park. One of the grandmothers came to me. I said the same thing. Well, these kids say they were coerced. They said, here he goes again, condemn me like they did Brawley. Those guys ended up doing 13 years in jail, and DNA finally came about, and a young man in jail said after they had done time now, 13 years, that he did it to his cellmate. His cellmate, trying to get some time off, told the authorities. They did a DNA check and found out his DNA matched, none of theirs did, and that in fact we were right, they didn't do the rape. So it becomes again part of who tells the story. They will always bring up Brawley in the 80s, but they won't bring up I was right on Central Park, or I was right on Howard Beach. Oh, did we make up Trayvon Martin? The jury said that Zimmerman wasn't guilty too. So I think you've got to stand up for what you believe and know you're going to get flack. But the question is the flack more important than your own self-confidence in what you believe? And I believe in what I believe, and I stood for it. That young man, I do rallies in New York every Saturday morning. No matter where I'm in the world, I'm home at National Action Network. And that young man's every Saturday morning did 13 years in jail for a rape he didn't commit. Couldn't get a job anywhere. And we hired him at National Action Network until he finally got a settlement. So I'm glad that I can be a guy that has enough courage to stand up. And I think people need to stand up more and test themselves. Don't only go with the cases that are popular. Many of the cases that I became known for, very few of them, if any, were known before we got involved. I'd never heard of Trayvon when they called me. And they asked me, he'd already been killed and buried. They asked would I come down. That's why I went. I went on the day, on my way down there, I found out my mother died, and I went anyway, because I felt my mother would have been shamed if I backed out the rally. We put 10,000 people there. If you read Trayvon's mother's book, she said that's what blew it up nationally. So our job is to say, yeah, nobody's going to believe it, and nobody's going to cover it, so we're going to force it. And that's what I do.
Thank you. Next question, we will go to the hand just here in the first row.
Thank you, Reverend, for your sharing. So I just want to chat a bit about the masterpiece bakery opinion that came out, I think, last night, where effectively, there was a very allegedly narrow opinion, right, that pertained specifically to that case. But I just want to use that as a springboard for discussing the wider relationship between religion and LGBTQ, queer rights, activism, and whatnot. And how do you feel these two forces relationship in the future would look like? And obviously the liberal force is trying to reform the church from within to allow for more progressive views towards LGBTQ issues and whatnot. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing these liberal reinterpretations or reforms within the churches? And what do you think are the best ways to combat, overcome these barriers and difficulties?
I think that the biggest barriers is that we must have the courage of those that centuries ago had the concept even around this institution, religious freedom. And religious freedom is religious freedom. And you can't have sin dictated by your preference or where you are in a given time of culture. Like I said, I grew up in a Pentecostal church. When I was growing up, they said it was a sin for women to wear lipstick and to wear pants. And then I saw one of the prominent women of the church in pants and lipstick, and I was convinced she was going to hell. Now, I mean, everybody does. So I think people should just say, first of all, you cannot determine someone's nature, and you cannot limit God to your cultural biases and act like God did it. No, that's you did that. Now, you can do and have your own beliefs, your own standards, your own values, fine, but don't interfere with someone else. My sister, I have one full sister who's 3 years older than me. My sister was gay, was gay, she's still alive. And I need to say that because it's going to she'll be talking about, what do you mean was? I'm not going Hi, Joy, you're still? And when I was 12, 13, started going to rallies, she used to take me to Greenwich Village, which was where at that time the gay community was in New York. And I grew up knowing that culture. And later in life, when the issue came up about same-sex marriage, I was in the early 21st century, I was getting ready to run for president. And I called her, I said, they're going to ask me about same-sex marriage. And I've always, dealt with trying to deal with the gay rights issues. And she was one who told me, you can't keep using the F word. I said, I use the N word. She says, yeah, but all of that is offensive. So I said, so the same-sex marriage thing, I said, I'm wrestling with that because it's marriage. She says, my partner. She has a partner who is white, live in Louisiana. You think I got courage? You have gay interracial couple in Louisiana, she got a lot of courage. But anyway, I said, yeah, I know your partner. She says, so let me get this right. If something happens to me, it's up to you whether she can get my house, my property that we built together. I thought she was a civil rights leader. It was my sister that made me understand I don't have the right to do that. And that's why I came out. I had ministers tell me, if you came out for same-sex marriage, you can't preach in my church anymore. And I used to do annual, so I said, I can't preach at your church anymore. Because you don't have the right to impose and legislate your religious beliefs. And that's the issue. We're arguing the wrong issue. The issue is not whether you consider it a sin or not. The issue is whether you have the right to legislate that, make that law. Now, the cake case, as you said, is narrow, but it can be a legal precedent for other cases. The baker is on a street that the sanitation department picks up his garbage. That's paid by taxpayers. He's regulated and protected by a police department that's paid by taxpayers. He's zoned in where he can have a business license paid by taxpayers. So we can pay all of that for you, but you can decide which ones of us you're going to serve? I don't think so.
Thank you. We'll go on to the next question, and the hand just halfway down.
Hello, thank you. I just want to thank you for coming in and be able to share your experiences with us. The question I ask is quite personal to me. I mean, I come from a mixed heritage, and my grandfather, he came to this country in 1960. And growing up with him, I always used to, ask him in what ways did he deal with coming to a country, so white from a country so black. And I often got the impression from him that, that the way in which he taught us to kind of deal with any problems with any person of any authority was kind of deference. It was kind of never really to question the way it goes, and it wasn't really up to us. We just kind of go with the flow because we're the ones who shouldn't make problems, because if we make problems, they'll kind of see us as, the problem makers rather than the problem solvers. So the question I ask you is really quite, how do I deal with, or how do we as a community deal with tackling this problem when certain members of our community don't really see there to be a problem to begin with? Rather, how do we tackle this post-colonial mindset that many of the older immigrant members have and have kind of passed on to a lot of immigrant of the lower generations today?
Very good question. I think that one of the things is that you've got to settle on early is that most successful human rights struggles in history are fought by a minority of the oppressed and never the majority. When Martin Luther King fought, he never had everybody on his side. He was put out of his own denominational church. And he fought anyhow. We never had a 1 million man march till 95. Dr. King was killed in 68. He always had to take the minority that would be willing to sacrifice, even the minority of ministers, and fight, and because he believed in it and had enough. All you need is enough to go. You're never going to have the majority of immigrants. You're never going to have the majority of blacks. You're never going to have the majority of Latinos or gays. It is always easier to go along to get along. But what I've learned in my career that I've seen is that the very people that say, why don't you quiet down, are the first ones that when we get a door open, run through with their resume and try to take advantage. And I've learned, I used to get angry. I learned to don't get angry because that's part of your job. And you just say, I know that the majority are not going to be with me. I know that even some of them are going to be critical, but I have to do this because this is what I believe and it's going to help everybody. And I've learned that over my life. I'm 63 years old. Y'all supposed to say, oh, you don't look like it. Come on. And I've learned, I've lived long enough and been in this long enough to understand that you're not going to get everybody with you. And if you wait on it, what is right is not always going to be popular, but it will always be right.
Thank you. Next question, we'll go to the gentleman in the first row.
I guess my question kind of deals with this concept of color blindness. So I would say we don't really live in a colorblind society. How do you engage with folks that really feel passionate about colorblind policies or believe that the world in fact is colorblind?
I tell people that I don't want you to be colorblind. Because if you've got to not see my color to deal with me, then you got a problem with my color. I want you to embrace diversity, not run from it. I don't see race. Well, race is there. I want you to see it and make sure that it is treated fairly and equally. Colorblindness to me is a cop-out. And I think that we need to deal with there is a diversity in the world, there are differences in the world, and we all deserve to be treated equally and fairly. And if you've got to eliminate my heritage, my melanin, my culture to deal with me, then you still have a problem with race. Because I am black, and I am whatever else. And I do have this pedigree or that lineage. And I don't have to apologize for it. In fact, I'm proud of it. And either I can be accepted on those terms or I'd rather not engage.
Thank you. As a follow-up question, so you finished your speech talking about the recent admissions report for the University of Oxford, stating how much further we still have to go. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the current higher education system in the US, in particular with regards to affirmative action policies that have been installed over the last few years?
First of all, affirmative action started under Richard Nixon, drafted by a man named Arthur Fletcher. It was a conservative remedy that has now become so much the rallying cry of conservatives. The reason that government had affirmative action to guarantee inclusion is it was the government that had the anti-affirmative action of exclusion. It was against the law for some of us to go to jail. Go to college, go to school to vote. So the government has to undo what the government did. Rosa Parks was not taken off the bus by the Ku Klux Klan. She was arrested. It was against the law to sit in the front of the bus. So it amazes me how they talk about why should we have to pay the debt? Because you're the one that took what happened in the unequal and unfair way that it was done. Or if somebody is a thief and they steal, rob, and plumage something, and their kids inherit it, and they're convicted of larceny, and they come and get the house and the car and whatever they bought with the criminal money. The kids can't turn around and say, well, why should you take that from me? My daddy did it, I didn't. But you're enjoying it. You're living off of something that was wrong. Affirmative action is about there's unequal distribution of wealth, distribution of education, distribution of services, and we've got to equalize it because it was taken that way. And just because some in this generation didn't do it, they still have the advantages of it. And they must understand that you've got to target to correct it because you targeted it to do it.
Thank you. We have time for one final question, so we'll go to the gentleman in the last row.
Thanks for coming to speak to us. You've spoken tonight about the symbolic value of having people of color represented in public positions of influence. My question is, isn't there a risk of confusing the systemic change with exceptional cases such as Barack Obama, such as Meghan Markle, such as Sadiq Khan getting into these positions? Because it's great for these individuals, but it's not great for Anglo-Caribbean citizens having their citizenship status challenged. It's not great for Muslim students in UK schools being monitored by their teachers for radicalization, and so forth. So what is the value of symbolic representation when it doesn't translate into social, economic, political, material progress for people of color?
The value of it is twofold. One is that if they were not in those positions, we'd still have to deal with those conditions. So they don't make the conditions worse. What they do is to those kids that have been told they cannot be anything, it gives them the affirmation that they can. And I think that you cannot ever rob the worldview of kids that need that inspiration. I remember a friend of mine who was very much in a different part of the movement than me, said to me, I just can't stand that slogan, I am somebody, that came out of the early 70s. And it's just, of course you're somebody. It sounds too begging and all of that. And I said, well, you know, maybe you didn't need nobody to tell you somebody. When I was growing up, we needed that. And I saluted the wedding and was touched. I wasn't even gonna watch it, but I was touched because I was in the gym. I work out very early in the morning. And I was in the gym and saw them interview a young black girl in Brixton who talked about what it meant to her. And I identified with that girl. And if that young lady can see her self-worth increase because of Meghan Markle, I'm not gonna rob her from that, but I'm still gonna talk about the things I talked about tonight. And I hope that in some way, shape, or form, the Markles of the world will find their way to deal with it. So I'm not excusing them, but I also know there's some people that need symbolism. Symbolism is powerful. It was a powerful thing. As much rancor as Donald Trump has, he cannot convince young black men and women in America they can't be president anymore because of Barack Obama. He can't ever get away with that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but please join me in thanking